Okay, this is going to be a brief supplementary video. I'm actually going to talk about two things. First of all, we have been reading a few chapters in the book of Ether because these chapters align approximately with the Egyptian captivity of Israel. They also bring us down through the life of Moses, and I believe through the book of Joshua. So I will not be returning back to Ether until we reach Judges, because that is when the next portion of the story of Ether aligns to the timeline of the Bible, approximately. These aren't exact, I can only approximate this. So in this timeline, we had Moses and Genesis reading at the same time, because the first 6 chapters of Genesis cover the same time period as the book of Moses. When we got to chapter 12 of Genesis, that became the time period when the book of Abraham takes place. And so we read the book of Abraham along with the chapters like 12 through 14 of Genesis. Ether began at the Tower of Babel, so that was just after chapter 11 of Genesis, I do believe. We read a few chapters which covered the span of the rest of the book of Genesis. Finished Genesis and returned to the book of Ether for the time period between Genesis and the Exodus. The 2 chapters we read in Ether covered the period from the end of Genesis down to the down to the reign of the judges, approximately. So that is where we are in the timeline. That is how the timeline has progressed. My second point on this video is I wanted to talk a little bit about that Egyptian captivity period. See, we don't have any record of what happened during this captivity. Not in the scriptures. There are Jewish traditions, and as I've mentioned, there is the book of Jasher, which actually has a very detailed account of what was going on during this Egyptian captivity. Some of it likely happened, a lot of it probably didn't. One thing I really like about Jasher, and I do want to share this story, is they actually explain how Israel became slaves in Egypt. And I like the way they did it. I like the story. I can't say that I believe I truly believe it actually happened this way, but I could see it happening this way. It's definitely a possibility. And that is when the Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph arose to make them slaves, he hired them all to help build the pyramids or build a city. And he also hired Egyptians. And over the course of a few months, he slowly withdrew the Egyptians from the work so that only the Israelites were working. And then he sent the Egyptians back as taskmasters to force the Egyptians to force the Israelites to continue to work. So when the Israelites said, wait, we're the only ones working here, and then the Pharaoh said, well, I'm not going to pay you anymore. You're just going to work for me. And Israel said, wait a minute, why would we keep working? And then he said, well, because if you don't, we're going to kill you. And so they were already at the work. They were already doing this. And then the Egyptians just kind of surrounded them and forced them to continue working without pay. So I think that's a very interesting narrative. I don't know if that's exactly how it happened, but I could definitely see that happening. The other point that I did want to make is the reason why the Levites, in this story, the reason why the Levites seem to be somewhat more free than the rest of Israel. Even in the Bible, when you read it, the tribe of Levi doesn't seem to be quite as oppressed as the rest of Israel. It's a subtle thing, and it's kind of odd. But according to the book of Jasher, the reason for that is because the Levites were the only tribe that did not accept the work. When the rest of Israel was hired to work on these cities, Levi suspected a trap. And so the tribe of Levi did not go to work with the rest of Israel. They stayed in Egypt, and they did become oppressed to a certain extent, but not as much. They were not the physical laborers like the rest of Israel was. That's just the story of Jasher. Anyways, but in actual scripture, we don't have any of this. We don't have any explanation of what was going on during this time period. In addition, we don't know how Moses got a hold of the records. Technically, we don't even know that he did get hold of the original records. We do know from the book of Moses that Adam kept a book of remembrance. From the very beginning, there was scripture being written. The prophets were keeping their history and their scriptures. They were writing the scriptures from the beginning. We know that Abraham had that record. From the book of Abraham, he states that the record of the fathers had come into his possession. The Jaredites had a copy of this record, because it was from this record that Achish was able to learn the secret oaths and everything through which he created his secret combinations among the Jaredites. So not only did these records exist, but there were multiple copies of them. Now, there is a theory, and I like this theory. I think it very likely is true. I can't say it definitively that it is true. There's no direct evidence for it, but it does explain things fairly well. And that is that Abraham had the record. When he died, Isaac got it. When Isaac died, Jacob got it. And when Jacob died, Joseph got the record. Now, when Joseph died, he was a little worried about preserving the record. He wanted to make sure that the Egyptians never got their hands on it. Because even though the Egyptians loved Joseph, but I think, according to the theory, Joseph kind of saw what was coming. He knew about, well, he did. Even in Genesis, we know that Joseph did prophesy of the bondage of Israel in Egypt. He knew they were going to be enslaved, and he wanted to protect the record. So he had his brothers promise to bury him in Canaan. And when his body was prepared, he was embalmed, he was mummified, but it says in the Bible that they put him in a coffin and kept him from being buried so that they could take him back to Canaan when the time came. The theory goes that Joseph took this record and he had it put in the coffin with him. When he died, he told the Israelites, when you put me in the coffin, put the records in with me, because he knew that the Egyptians' religion would not permit them to disturb the dead. Even after the Egyptians enslaved Israel, he knew that if they were buried with him, if the scriptures, if this record was placed within the coffin, the Egyptians would not touch it. They were too scared of desecrating the dead. Now, 150 years or so later, Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt into Canaan. When they leave, they take Joseph's body with them. They take the coffin with them. And that is when Moses gets the record. And from that record, he abridges and writes his own kind of shortened version, which we have as the book of Genesis. Remember, Genesis is not that original record. It is at most, it is an abridgment of that record. It may possibly be just a vision that Moses had. I don't think that is accurate because it's too similar to the book of Abraham. We know that Abraham wrote. The book of Abraham is a separate record that Abraham made. He had the original record, which he added to, just like Isaac would later and Jacob. But he made a separate record, which he gave to the Egyptians, and that was what we have as the book of Abraham. And it is similar enough to Genesis to indicate that both Genesis and the book of Abraham are based, to some extent, on this original record. And that is why we wonder how Moses got that original record, and this is the theory of how that happened. So I just wanted to share that. It was some interesting information, I thought. And remember, as we continue through reading the standard works, the records, or the scriptures, because they're really the same thing, but the records are vitally important throughout the scriptures. And this is a recurring theme in all of the standard works. Having a record of the fathers, knowing where we came from, is of vital importance. History. People say, oh, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, which is true. But history is far more than just learning from the past. History is what identifies us. It's what gives us our identity as a people, is history. History is far more important and far more powerful a force in the world, in our lives, than most people even understand. Even most historians don't truly understand the power that history has. At least not modern historians. I think ancient historians, even up till the mid-1900s, historians had an idea of the power of history. In the modern day, we have lost sight of this power. And as I go through this series of reading through the standard works, I want you, as you follow along with me, to pay attention to the records, how often they are mentioned, what significance they have, how they influence the events that are going on. Because these things are of paramount importance in everything. But I'm going to leave that here, and I will see you in the next video.